Hello again, and welcome back to Baby Alice's stories. We now return to The Adventures of Sinbad the Sailor by Arabian Nights. The first voyage of Sinbad the Sailor. My father was a wealthy merchant of much repute. He bequeathed me a large estate, which I wasted in riotous living. I quickly perceived my error, and that I was misspending my time, which is of all things the most valuable. I remembered the saying of the great Solomon, which I had frequently heard from my father. A good name is better than precious ointment. And again, wisdom is good with an inheritance. Struck with these reflections, I resolved to walk in my father's ways, and I entered into a contract with some merchants, and embarked with them on board a ship we had jointly fitted out. We set sail and steered our course toward the Indies, through the Persian Gulf, which is formed by the coasts of Arabia Felix on the right, and by those of Persia on the left. At first I was troubled with seasickness, but speedily recovered my health, and was not afterward subject to that complaint. In our voyage we touched at several islands, where we sold or exchanged our goods. One day, while under sail, we were becalmed near a small island, but little elevated above the level of the water, and resembling a green meadow. The captain ordered his sails to be furled, and permitted such persons as were so inclined to land. Of this number I was one. But while we were enjoying ourselves in eating and drinking, and recovering ourselves from the fatigue of the sea, the island on a sudden trembled, and shook us terribly. The trembling of the island was perceived on board the ship, and we were called upon to re-embark speedily, or we should all be lost. For what we took for an island proved to be the back of a sea monster. The nimblest got into the sloop, others betook themselves to swimming, but as for myself, I was still upon the island when it disappeared into the sea, and I had only time to catch hold of a piece of wood that we had brought out of the ship to make a fire. Meanwhile, the captain, having received those on board who were in the sloop, and taken up some of those that swam, resolved to improve the favorable gale that had just risen, and hoisting his sails, pursued his voyage, so that it was impossible for me to recover the ship. Thus I was exposed to the mercy of the waves all the rest of the day and the following night. By this time I found my strength gone, and despaired of saving my life, when happily a wave threw me against an island. The bank was high and rugged, so that I could scarcely have got up, had it not been for some roots of trees which I found within reach when the sun arose, though I was very feeble, both from hard labor and want of food. I crept along to find some herbs fit to eat, and had the good luck not only to procure some, but likewise to discover a spring of excellent water, which contributed much to recover me. After this I advanced farther into the island, and at last reached a fine plain, where I perceived some horses feeding. I went toward them, when I heard the voice of a man, who immediately appeared and asked me who I was. I related to him my adventure, after which, taking me by the hand, he led me into a cave, where there were several other people, no less amazed to see me than I was to see them. I partook of some provisions which they offered me. I then asked them what they did in such a desert place, to which they answered that they were grooms belonging to the Maharaja, sovereign of the island, and that every year they brought thither the king's horses for pasturage. They added that they were to return home on the morrow, and had I been 1 day later, I must have perished, because the inhabited part of the island was a great distance off, and it would have been impossible for me to have got thither without a guide. Next morning they returned to the capital of the island, took me with them, and presented me to the Maharaja, who asked me who I was, and by what adventure I had come into his dominions. After I had satisfied him, he told me he was much concerned for my misfortune, and at the same time ordered that I should want for nothing, which commands his officers were so generous and careful as to see exactly fulfilled. Being a merchant, I frequented men of my own profession, and particularly inquired for those who were strangers, that perchance I might hear news from Baghdad, or find an opportunity to return. For the Maharaja's capital is situated on the sea coast, and has a fine harbor, where ships arrive daily from the different quarters of the world. I frequented also the society of the learned Indians, and took delight to hear them converse, but withal I took care to make my court regularly to the Maharaja, and converse with the governors and petty kings, his tributaries, that were about him. They put 1,000 questions respecting my country, and I, being willing to inform myself as to their laws and customs, asked them concerning everything which I thought worth knowing. There belongs to this king an island named Cassel. They assured me that every night a noise of drums was heard there, whence the mariners fancied that it was the residence of Gegial. I determined to visit this wonderful place, and in my way thither saw fishes of 100 and 200 cubits long, that occasion more fear than hurt. For they are so timorous that they will fly upon the rattling of 2 sticks or boards. I saw likewise other fish, about a cubit in length, that had heads like owls. As I was one day at the port after my return, the ship arrived in which I had embarked at Bussorah. I at once knew the captain, and I went and asked him for my bales. "I am Sinbad," said I, "and those bales marked with this name are mine." When the captain heard me speak thus, "Heavens!" he exclaimed, "who can we trust in these times? I saw Sinbad perish with my own eyes, as did also the passengers on board. And yet you tell me you are that Sinbad? What impudence is this? And what a false tale to tell, in order to possess yourself of what does not belong to you." "Have patience," replied I. "Do me the favor to hear what I have to say." The captain was at length persuaded that I was no cheat, for there came people from his ship who knew me, paid me great compliments, and expressed much joy at seeing me alive. At last he recollected me himself, and embracing me, "Heaven be praised," he said, "for your happy escape. I cannot express the joy it affords me. There are your goods. Take and do with them as you please." I took out what was most valuable in my bales, and presented them to the Maharaja, who, knowing my misfortune, asked me how I came by such rarities. I acquainted him with the circumstance of their recovery. He was pleased at my good luck, accepted my present, and in return gave me one much more considerable. Upon this I took leave of him, and went aboard the same ship after I had exchanged my goods for the commodities of that country. I carried with me wood of aloes, sandals, camphor, nutmegs, cloves, pepper, and ginger. We passed by several islands, and at last arrived at Bussorah, from whence I came to the city, with the value of 100,000 sequins. Sinbad stopped here and ordered the musicians to proceed with their concert, which the story had interrupted. When it was evening, Sinbad sent for a purse of 100 sequins and gave it to the porter. Said, "Take this, Sinbad, return to your home, and come back tomorrow to hear more of my adventures." The porter went away, astonished at the honor done him and the present made him. The account of this adventure proved very agreeable to his wife and children, who did not fail to return thanks for what Providence had sent them by the hand of Sinbad. Sinbad put on his best robe next day and returned to the bountiful traveller, who received him with a pleasant air and welcomed him heartily. When all the guests had arrived, dinner was served and continued a long time. When it was ended, Sinbad, addressing himself to the company, said, "Gentlemen, be pleased to listen to the adventures of my second voyage. They deserve your attention even more than those of the first." Upon which everyone held his peace, and Sinbad proceeded. The second voyage of Sinbad the sailor. I designed after my first voyage to spend the rest of my days at Baghdad, but it was not long ere I grew weary of an indolent life, and I put to sea a second time with merchants of known probity. We embarked on board a good ship, and after recommending ourselves to God, set sail. We traded from island to island and exchanged commodities with great profit. One day we landed on an island covered with several sorts of fruit trees, but we could see neither man nor animal. We walked in the meadows, along the streams that watered them, while some diverted themselves with gathering flowers and other fruits. I took my wine and provisions and sat down near a stream betwixt two high trees, which formed a thick shade. I made a good meal, and afterward fell asleep. I cannot tell how long I slept, but when I awoke, the ship was gone. In this sad condition, I was ready to die with grief. I cried out in agony, beat my head and breast, and threw myself upon the ground, where I lay some time in despair. I upbraided myself 100 times for not being content with the produce of my first voyage that might have sufficed me all my life. But all this was in vain, and my repentance came too late. At last I resigned myself to the will of God. Not knowing what to do, I climbed to the top of a lofty tree, from whence I looked about on all sides, to see if I could discover anything that could give me hope. When I gazed toward the sea, I could see nothing but sky and water. But looking over the land, I beheld something white, and coming down, I took what provision I had left and went toward it, the distance being so great that I could not distinguish what it was. As I approached, I thought it to be a white dome of a prodigious height and extent, and when I came up to it, I touched it and found it to be very smooth. I went round to see if it was open on any side, but saw it was not, and that there was no climbing up to the top, as it was so smooth. It was at least 50 paces round. By this time the sun was about to set, and all of a sudden the sky became as dark as if it had been covered with a thick cloud. I was much astonished at this sudden darkness, but much more when I found it was occasioned by a bird of a monstrous size that came flying toward me. I remembered that I had often heard mariners speak of a miraculous bird called the Roc, and conceived that the great dome which I so much admired must be its egg. In short, the bird alighted and sat over the egg. As I perceived her coming, I crept close to the egg, so that I had before me one of the legs of the bird, which was as big as the trunk of a tree. I tied myself strongly to it with my turban, in hopes that the roc next morning would carry me with her out of this desert island. After having passed the night in this condition, the bird flew away as soon as it was daylight, and carried me so high that I could not discern the earth. She afterward descended with so much rapidity that I lost my senses. But when I found myself on the ground, I speedily untied the knot, and had scarcely done so when the roc, having taken up a serpent of a monstrous length in her bill, flew away. The spot where it left me was encompassed on all sides by mountains that seemed to reach above the clouds, and so steep that there was no possibility of getting out of the valley. This was a new perplexity, so that when I compared this place with the desert island from which the roc had brought me, I found that I had gained nothing by the change. As I walked through this valley, I perceived it was strewn with diamonds, some of which were of surprising bigness. I took pleasure in looking upon them, but shortly I saw at a distance such objects as greatly diminished my satisfaction, and which I could not view without terror, namely a great number of serpents, so monstrous that the least of them was capable of swallowing an elephant. They retired in the daytime to their dens, where they hid themselves from the roc, their enemy, and came out only in the night. I spent the day in walking about in the valley, resting myself at times in such places as I thought most convenient. When night came on, I went into a cave where I thought I might repose in safety. I secured the entrance, which was low and narrow, with a great stone to preserve me from the serpents, but not so far as to exclude the light. I supped on part of my provisions, but the serpents, which began hissing around me, put me into such extreme fear that I did not sleep. When day appeared, the serpents retired, and I came out of the cave trembling. I can justly say that I walked upon diamonds without feeling any inclination to touch them. At last I sat down, and notwithstanding my apprehensions, not having closed my eyes during the night, fell asleep after having eaten a little more of my provisions. But I had scarcely shut my eyes when something that fell by me with a great noise awakened me. It was a large piece of raw meat, and at the same time I saw several others fall down from the rocks in different places. I had always regarded as fabulous what I had heard sailors and others relate of the Valley of Diamonds, and of the stratagems employed by merchants to obtain jewels from thence. But now I found that they had stated nothing but the truth. For the fact is that the merchants come to the neighborhood of this valley when the eagles have young ones, and throwing great joints of meat into the valley, the diamonds upon whose points they fall stick to them. The eagles, which are stronger in this country than anywhere else, pounce with great force upon these pieces of meat, and carry them to their nests on the precipices of the rocks to feed their young. The merchants at this time run to their nests, disturb and drive off the eagles by their shouts, and take away the diamonds that stick to the meat. I perceived in this device the means of my deliverance. Having collected together the largest diamonds I could find, and put them into the leather bag in which I used to carry my provisions, I took the largest of the pieces of meat, tied it close round me with the cloth of my turban, and laid myself upon the ground, with my face downward, the bag of diamonds being made fast to my girdle. I had scarcely placed myself in this posture, when one of the eagles, having taken me up with the piece of meat to which I was fastened, carried me to his nest on the top of the mountain. The merchants immediately began their shouting to frighten the eagles, and when they had obliged them to quit their prey, one of them came to the nest where I was. He was much alarmed when he saw me, but recovering himself, instead of inquiring how I came thither, began to quarrel with me, and asked why I stole his goods. "You will treat me," replied I, "with more civility when you know me better. Do not be uneasy. I have diamonds enough for you and myself, more than all the other merchants together. Whatever they have they owe to chance, but I selected for myself, in the bottom of the valley, those which you see in this bag." I had scarcely done speaking when the other merchants came crowding about us, much astonished to see me, but they were much more surprised when I told them my story. They conducted me to their encampment, and there, having opened my bag, they were surprised at the largeness of my diamonds, and confessed that they had never seen any of such size and perfection. I prayed the merchant who owned the nest to which I had been carried, for every merchant had his own, to take as many for his share as he pleased. He contented himself with one, and that, too, the least of them, and when I pressed him to take more, without fear of doing me any injury, "No," said he, "I am very well satisfied with this, which is valuable enough to save me the trouble of making any more voyages, and will raise as great a fortune as I desire." I spent the night with the merchants, to whom I related my story a second time, for the satisfaction of those who had not heard it. I could not moderate my joy when I found myself delivered from the danger I have mentioned. I thought myself in a dream, and could scarcely believe myself out of danger. The merchants had thrown their pieces of meat into the valley for several days, and each of them being satisfied with the diamonds that had fallen to his lot, we left the place the next morning, and travelled near high mountains, where there were serpents of a prodigious length, which we had the good fortune to escape. We took shipping at the first port we reached, and touched at the Isle of Roha, where the trees grow that yield camphor. This tree is so large and its branches so thick that 100 men may easily sit under its shade. The juice of which the camphor is made exudes from a hole bored in the upper part of the tree, and is received in a vessel, where it thickens to a consistency and becomes what we call camphor. After the juice is thus drawn out, the tree withers and dies. In this island is also found the rhinoceros, an animal less than the elephant, but larger than the buffalo. It has a horn up its nose, about a cubit in length. The horn is solid, and cleft through the middle. The rhinoceros fights with the elephant, runs his horn into his belly, and carries him off upon his head. But the blood and the fat of the elephant running into his eyes and making him blind, he falls to the ground, and then, strange to relate, the roc comes and carries them both away in her claws, for food for her young ones. I pass over many other things peculiar to this island, lest I should weary you. Here I exchanged some of my diamonds for merchandise. From hence we went to other islands, and at last, having touched at several trading towns of the continent, we landed at Bussorah, from whence I proceeded to Baghdad. There I immediately gave large presents to the poor, and lived honorably upon the vast riches I had brought, and gained with so much fatigue. Thus Sinbad ended the relation of the second voyage, gave Sinbad another 100 sequins, and invited him to come the next day to hear the account of the third. The third voyage of Sinbad the sailor. I soon again grew weary of living a life of idleness, and hardening myself against the thought of any danger, I embarked with some merchants on another long voyage. We touched at several ports, where we traded. One day we were overtaken by a dreadful tempest, which drove us from our course. The storm continued several days and brought us before the port of an island, which the captain was very unwilling to enter. But we were obliged to cast anchor. When we had furled our sails, the captain told us that this and some other neighboring islands were inhabited by hairy savages, who would speedily attack us. And though they were but dwarfs, we must make no resistance, for they were more in number than the locusts, and if we happened to kill one, they would all fall upon us and destroy us. We soon found that what the captain had told us was but too true. An innumerable multitude of frightful savages, about 2 feet high, covered all over with red hair, came swimming towards us and encompassed our ship. They chattered as they came near, but we understood not their language. They climbed up the sides of the ship with such agility as surprised us. They took down our sails, cut the cable, and hauling to the shore made us all get out, and afterward carried the ship into another island from whence they had come. As we advanced, we perceived at a distance a vast pile of building, and made toward it. We found it to be a palace, elegantly built and very lofty, with a gate of ebony of 2 leaves, which we opened. We saw before us a large apartment with a porch, having on one side a heap of human bones, and on the other a vast number of roasting spits. We trembled at this spectacle, and were seized with deadly apprehension, when suddenly the gate of the apartment opened with a loud crash, and there came out the horrible figure of a black man, as tall as a lofty palm tree. He had but one eye, and that in the middle of his forehead, where it blazed bright as a burning coal. His 4 teeth were very long and sharp, and stood out of his mouth, which was as deep as that of a horse. His upper lip hung down upon his breast. His ears resembled those of an elephant, and covered his shoulders, and his nails were as long and crooked as the talons of the greatest birds. At the sight of so frightful a genie, we became insensible, and lay like dead men. At last we came to ourselves, and saw him sitting in the porch looking at us. When he had considered us well, he advanced towards us, and laying his hand upon me, took me up by the nape of my neck, and turned me round, as a butcher would do a sheep's head. After having examined me, and perceiving me to be so lean that I was nothing but skin and bone, he let me go. He took up all the rest, one by one, and viewed them in the same manner. The captain being the fattest, he held him with one hand, as I would do a sparrow, and thrust a spit through him. He then kindled a great fire, roasted, and ate him in his apartment for his supper. Having finished his repast, he returned to his porch, where he lay and fell asleep, snoring louder than thunder. He slept thus till morning. As for ourselves, it was not possible for us to enjoy any rest, so that we passed the night in the most painful apprehension that can be imagined. When day appeared, the giant awoke, got up, went out, and left us in the palace. The next night, we determined to revenge ourselves on the brutish giant, and did so in the following manner. After he had again finished his inhuman supper on another of our seamen, he lay down on his back and fell asleep. As soon as we heard him snore, according to his custom, 9 of the boldest among us and myself took each of us a spit, and putting the points of them into the fire till they were burning hot, we thrust them into his eye all at once and blinded him. The pain made him break out into a frightful yell. He started up and stretched out his hands in order to sacrifice some of us to his rage. But we ran to such places as he could not reach, and after having sought for us in vain, he groped for the gate and went out howling in agony. We immediately left the palace and came to the shore, where, with some timber that lay about in great quantities, we made some rafts, and each large enough to carry 3 men. We waited until day to get upon them, for we hoped, if the giant did not appear by sunrise and give over his howling, which we still heard, he would prove to be dead. And if that happened to be the case, we resolved to stay on that island and not to risk our lives upon the rafts. But day had scarcely appeared when we perceived our cruel enemy with 2 others, almost of the same size, leading him, and a great number more coming before him at a quick pace. We did not hesitate to take to our rafts, but put to sea with all the speed we could. The giants, who perceived this, took up great stones, and running to the shore, they entered the water to the middle, and threw so exactly that they sank all the rafts but that I was upon. And all my companions, except the 2 with me, were drowned. We rowed with all our might, and got out of the reach of the giants. But when we got out to sea, we were exposed to the mercy of the waves and winds, and spent that day and the following night under the most painful uncertainty as to our fate. But next morning we had the good fortune to be thrown upon an island, where we landed with much joy. We found excellent fruit, which afforded us great relief and recruited our strength. At night we went to sleep on the seashore, but were awakened by the noise of a serpent of surprising length and thickness, whose scales made a rustling noise as he wound himself along. It swallowed up one of my comrades, notwithstanding his loud cries and the efforts he made to extricate himself from it. Dashing him several times against the ground, it crushed him, and we could hear it gnaw and tear the poor fellow's bones, though we had fled to a considerable distance. The following day, to our great terror, we saw the serpent again, when I explained, "O heaven! To what dangers are we exposed? We rejoiced yesterday at having escaped from the cruelty of a giant and the rage of the waves. Now are we fallen into another danger equally dreadful." As we walked about, we saw a large tall tree, upon which we designed to pass the following night for our security. and having satisfied our hunger with fruit, we mounted it accordingly. Shortly after, the serpent came hissing to the foot of the tree, raising itself up against the trunk of it, and meeting with my comrade, who sat lower than I, swallowed him at once, and went off. I remained upon the tree till it was day, and then came down, more like a dead man than one alive, expecting the same fate as had befallen my two companions. This filled me with horror, and I advanced some steps to throw myself into the sea, but I withstood this dictate of despair and submitted myself to the will of God, who disposes of our lives at his pleasure. In the meantime, I collected together a great quantity of small wood, brambles, and dry thorns, and making them up unto faggots, made a wide circle with them round the tree, and also tied some of them to the branches over my head. Having done this, when the evening came, I shut myself up within this circle, with the melancholy satisfaction that I had neglected nothing which could preserve me from the cruel destiny with which I was threatened. The serpent failed not to come at the usual hour, and went round the tree, seeking for an opportunity to devour me, but was prevented by the rampart I had made, so that he lay till day like a cat, watching in vain for a mouse that has fortunately reached a place of safety. When day appeared, he retired, but I dared not leave my fort until the sun arose. God took compassion on my hopeless state, for just as I was going, in a fit of desperation, to throw myself into the sea, I perceived a ship in the distance. I called as loud as I could, and unfolding the linen of my turban, displayed it, that they might observe me. This had the desired effect. The crew perceived me, and the captain sent his boat for me. As soon as I came on board, the merchants and seamen flocked about me to know how I came into that desert island. And after I had related to them all that had befallen me, the oldest among them said they had several times heard of the giants that dwell on that island, and that they were cannibals. And as to the serpents, they added that there were abundant in the island, that they hid themselves by day and came aboard by night. After having testified their joy at my escaping so many dangers, they brought me the best of their provisions, and took me before the captain, who, seeing that I was in rags, gave me one of his own suits. Looking steadfastly upon him, I knew him to be the person who, on my second voyage, had left me in the island where I fell asleep, and had sailed without me, or without sending to seek for me. I was not surprised that he, believing me to be dead, did not recognize me. "Captain," said I, "look at me, and you may know that I am Sinbad, whom you left in that desert island." The captain, having considered me attentively, recognized me. "God be praised," said he, embracing me. "I rejoice that fortune has rectified my fault. There are your goods, which I always took care to preserve." I took them from him, and made him my acknowledgments for his care of them. We continued at sea for some time, touched at several islands, and at last landed at that of Salabat, where sandalwood is obtained, which is much used in medicine. From the Isle of Salabat we went to another, where I furnished myself with cloves, cinnamon, and other spices. As we sailed from this island, we saw a tortoise, 20 cubits in length and breadth. We observed also an amphibious animal, like a cow, which gave milk. Its skin is so hard that they usually make bucklers of it. I saw another which had the shape and color of a camel. In short, after a long voyage I arrived at Bussorah, and from thence returned to Baghdad with so much wealth that I knew not its extent. I gave a great deal to the poor and bought another considerable estate. Thus Sinbad finished the history of his third voyage. He gave another 100 sequins to Sindbad and invited him to dinner again the next day to hear the fourth voyage of Sinbad the sailor. After I had rested from the dangers of my third voyage, my passion for trade and my love for novelty soon again prevailed. I therefore settled my affairs and provided a stock of goods fit for the traffic I designed to engage in. I took the route to Persia, traveled over several provinces, then arrived at a port where I embarked. On putting out to sea, we were overtaken by such a sudden gust of wind as obliged the captain to lower his yards and take all other necessary precautions to prevent the danger that threatened us. But all was in vain. Our endeavors had no effect. The sails were split in 1,000 pieces, and the ship was stranded. Several of the merchants and seamen were drowned, and the cargo was lost. I had the good fortune, with several of the merchants and mariners, to gain upon some planks, and we were carried by the current to an island which lay before us. There we found fruit and spring water, which preserved our lives. We stayed all night near the place where we had been cast ashore. Next morning, as soon as the sun was up, we explored the island and saw some houses, which we approached. As soon as we drew near, we were encompassed by a great number of Negroes who seized us, shared us among them, and carried us to their respective habitations. I and 5 of my comrades were carried to one place. Here they made us sit down and gave us a certain herb, which they made signs to us to eat. My comrades, not taking notice that the blacks ate none of it themselves, thought only of satisfying their hunger, and ate with greediness. But I, suspecting some trick, would not so much as taste it, which happened well for me, for in a little time after I perceived my companions had lost their senses, and that when they spoke to me, they knew not what they said. The Negroes fed us afterward with rice, prepared with oil of coconuts, and my comrades, who had lost their reason, ate of it greedily. I also partook of it, but very sparingly. They gave us that herb at first on purpose to deprive us of our senses, that we might not be aware of the sad destiny prepared for us. And they supplied us with rice to fatten us, for, being cannibals, their design was to eat us as soon as we grew fat. This accordingly happened, for they devoured my comrades, who were not sensible of their condition. But my senses being entire, you may easily guess that instead of growing fat as the rest did, I grew leaner every day. The fear of death turned all my food into poison. I fell into a languishing distemper, which proved my safety, for the Negroes, having killed and eaten my companions, seeing me to be withered, lean, and sick, deferred my death. Meanwhile, I had much liberty, so that scarcely any notice was taken of what I did, and this gave me an opportunity one day to get at a distance from the houses and to make an escape. An old man who saw me and suspected my design called to me as loud as he could to return. But instead of obeying him, I redoubled my speed and quickly got out of sight. At that time there was none but the old man about the houses, the rest being abroad, and not to return till night, which was usual with them. Therefore, being sure that they could not arrive in time to pursue me, I went on till night, when I stopped to rest a little, and to eat some of the provisions I had secured. But I speedily set forward again, and travelled 7 days, avoiding those places which seemed to be inhabited, and lived for the most part upon coconuts, which served me both for meat and drink. On the 8th day I came near the sea, and saw some white people like myself, gathering pepper, of which there was great plenty in that place. This I took to be a good omen, and went to them without any scruple. The people who gathered pepper came to meet me as soon as they saw me, and asked me in Arabic who I was and whence I came. I was overjoyed to hear them speak in my own language, and I satisfied their curiosity by giving them an account of my shipwreck and how I fell into the hands of the Negroes. "Those Negroes," replied they, "eat men, and by what miracle did you escape their cruelty?" I related to them the circumstances I have just mentioned, at which they were wonderfully surprised. I stayed with them till they had gathered their quantity of pepper, and then sailed with them to the island from whence they had come. They presented me to their king, who was a good prince. He had the patience to hear the relation of my adventures, which surprised him, and he afterward gave me clothes, and commanded care to be taken of me. The island was very well peopled, plentiful in everything, and the capital a place of great trade. This agreeable retreat was very comfortable to me after my misfortunes, and the kindness of this generous prince completed my satisfaction. In a word, there was not a person more in favor with him than myself, and consequently every man in court and city sought to oblige me, so that in a very little time I was looked upon rather as a native than a stranger. I observed one thing, which to me appeared very extraordinary. All the people, the king himself not excepted, rode their horses without bridle or stirrups. I went one day to a workman, and gave him a model for making the stock of a saddle. When that was done, I covered it myself with velvet and leather, and embroidered it with gold. I afterward went to a smith, who made me a bit, according to the pattern I showed him, and also some stirrups. When I had all these things completed, I presented them to the king, and put them upon one of his horses. His Majesty mounted immediately, and was so pleased with them that he testified his satisfaction by the large presents. I made several others for the ministers and principal officers of his household, which gained me great reputation and regard. As I paid my court very constantly to the king, he said to me one day, "Sinbad, I love thee. I have one thing to demand of thee, which thou must grant. I have a mind thou shouldest marry, that so thou mayest stay in my dominions, and think no more of thy own country." I durst not resist the prince's will, and he gave me one of the ladies of his court, noble, beautiful, and rich. The ceremonies of marriage being over, I went and dwelt with my wife, and for some time we lived together in perfect harmony. I was not, however, satisfied with my banishment. Therefore I designed to make my escape at the first opportunity, and return to Baghdad, which my present settlement, how advantageous soever, could not make me forget. At this time, the wife of one of my neighbors, whom I had contracted a very strict friendship, fell sick and died. I went to see and comfort him in his affliction, and finding him absorbed in sorrow, I said to him, as soon as I saw him, God preserve you and grant you a long life. Alas, replied he, how do you think I should obtain the favor you wish me? I have not above an hour to live, for I must be buried this day with my wife. This is a law on this island. The living husband is interred with the dead wife, and the living wife with the dead husband. While he was giving me an account of this barbarous custom, the very relation of which chilled my blood, his kindred, friends, and neighbors came to assist at the funeral. They dressed the corpse of the woman in her richest apparel and all her jewels, as if it had been her wedding day. Then they placed her on an open bier and began their march to the place of burial. The husband walked first, next to the dead body, then proceeded to a high mountain, and when they had reached the place of their destination, they took up a large stone which formed the mouth of a deep pit, and let down the body with all its apparel and jewels. Then the husband, embracing his kindred and friends, without resistance, suffered himself to be placed on another bier, with a pot of water and 7 small loaves, and was let down in the same manner. The ceremony being over, the mouth of the pit was again covered with the stone, and the company returned. I mention this ceremony the more particularly because I was in a few weeks' time to be the principal actor on a similar occasion. Alas, my own wife fell sick and died. I made every remonstrance I could to the king not to expose me, a foreigner, to this inhuman law. I appealed in vain. The king and all his court, with the most considerable persons of the city, sought to soften my sorrow by honoring the funeral ceremony with their presence. And at the termination of the ceremony, I was lowered into the pit with a vessel full of water and 7 loaves. As I approached the bottom, I discovered, by the aid of the little light that came from above, the nature of this subterranean place. It seemed an endless cavern, and might be about 50 fathoms deep. I lived for some time upon my bread and water, when one day, just as I was on the point of exhaustion, I heard something tread, and breathing or panting as it moved. I followed the sound. The animal seemed to stop sometimes, but always fled and breathed hard as I approached. I pursued it for a considerable time, till at last I perceived a light, resembling a star. I went on, sometimes lost sight of it, but always found it again, and at last discovered that it came through a hole in the rock, which I got through and found myself upon the seashore, at which I felt exceeding joy. I prostrated myself on the shore to thank God for this mercy, and shortly afterward I perceived a ship making for the place where I was. I made a sign with the linen of my turban, and called to the crew as loud as I could. They heard me, and sent a boat to bring me on board. It was fortunate for me that these people did not inspect the place where they found me, but without hesitation took me on board. We passed by several islands, and among others that called the Isles of Bells. About 10 days' sail from Serendib with a regular wind, and 6 from that of Kela, where we landed. Landmines are found in the island, also Indian canes and excellent camphor. The king of the Isle of Kela is very rich and powerful, and the Isle of Bells, which is about 2 days' journey away, is also subject to him. The inhabitants are so barbarous that they still eat human flesh. The inhabitants are so barbarous that they still eat human flesh. After we had finished our traffic in that island, we put out to sea again and touched at several other ports. At last, I arrived happily at Baghdad. Out of gratitude to God and His mercies, I contributed liberally toward the support of several mosques and the subsistence of the poor. Out of gratitude to God and His mercies, I contributed liberally toward the support of several mosques and the subsistence of the poor, and enjoyed myself with my friends in festivities and amusements. Here, Sinbad made a new present of 100 sequins to Sinbad, whom he requested to return with the rest next day at the same hour, to dine with him and hear the story of his 5th voyage.